How's everybody doing? Hoping you're having a fantastic day. So we're going to be getting into the sixth video on the devolution, the development or evolution of Catholic dogma. So this should be really fun. I'm looking forward to it because this has been one of my favorite studies that I've been doing because I think this is some of the more important things that we need to be focusing on. I think this pushes back against some abuses of uh, the evolution of dogma that's taken by liberals, some of the false denials, I guess, from certain traditionalists. And then also, this is of apologetic necessity because we do need to use this appropriately when we approach Orthodox and then also Protestants. And this is something that we're unique in as a church which is both living and also identical in substantial form to what the church was in the beginning as established by our Lord. So definitely, if you haven't watched the earlier videos, definitely do, because a few of the things I'm going to say today will not make any sense if you haven't watched the earlier videos. So if you're watching right now, haven't watched the earlier videos, go watch them. Each one of these are only 20 to 30 minutes long. I like to keep them short so I can more frequently release these videos. And then also, before we begin, this will be the last video in the introductory sort of section. After this, we're going to be kind of diving right into a lot of select topics on the development of doctrine. So at this point, you should have a bit of a solid understanding of how things are going to look. And we're going to be sort of putting some meat on the bones and looking at some of the historical errors of some theologians when it came to how they interpreted this. And even eventually we're going to get into a bit of discussion about how Newman had some errors taken from Suarez mixed with a little bit of his Englishness. So before we begin, I just wanted to remind you, if you do appreciate me doing this series, I will be doing a lot more series like these in the future. I hope that this sort of becomes the foundation for a lot of the work I do. I think this is something which is unique. Not many people are doing things like this. I have a lot of good topics planned out for the future for other series that I'm going to be diving into. But if you do really appreciate this and you would like me to do more of that, do consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/militantthomist. Helps me out and allows me to dedicate a lot more time to this and to produce a lot more content. So definitely consider that. Okay, so I will begin. So what we need to first distinguish, because as I mentioned earlier before, I think 2 videos ago or 3 videos ago, when it comes to that second degree reasoning, because we distinguish between the first degree, which, if you don't remember, is about a premise and a conclusion that are only nominally distinct. For example, going from man to rational animal, we're merely going from the obscure to the more clear. And then on the other side, you have the third degree, which is from 2 really distinct propositions. So it's going to be going from, this is how we kind of think of experimental sciences, I guess you could say. We go from a certain principle, and then you input some data, and then out of it comes a solution that was not already contained in the principle. And then in between the two, what we have been talking about and what the most important function of theology is. Actually, it's not the most important function. It's the second most important function, sorry. The second most important function of theology, after the contemplation and clarification of the revealed data into dogmas, is going to be the drawing forth of theological conclusions and then the synthesis of those conclusions. So this is going to be done in 2 ways. The first way, we already talked about that, essence to properties. Now, the second way is going to be from cause to effect. And these are going to stay objectively identical. So the premise and the conclusion are in object, in reality, identical. Yet there's a foundation reality for regarding them as distinct. So they are objectively identical, but subjectively distinct. They are distinct concept or distinct rationes, which is the sort of Latin term, which we try to translate, yet is kind of just um, intranslatable, I guess you could say, because it's like sort of that idea of something which is not purely nominal, that is not purely a difference in naming, but is also not something which is objectively distinct in reality, but it also has some sort of foundation in reality and is distinguished in the mind. So you see, it's between two extremes, but it's a bit difficult for us to, no pun intended, conceptualize. So we already went over in last video the first, from essence to properties. So this is going to be from, for example, uh, ideal man to actual risibility, or from the basic essence of man to the potential for risibility, or that chart we had with 6 different options, and we distinguish between the various ways in which would be a second or a third degree process of reasoning. So for this one, it's going to be a lot simpler, and this is going to be a much shorter video, which is kind of why I tried to preface it with a lot of details of where we've been, where we're going, because this is kind of a conclusion video for the first part. So here we distinguish only between 2 different types of causes in their relation to their effects. So the first type of cause is going to be a cause that is really, or as we say otherwise, and I think is more helpful, objectively distinct from its effects. So if we look at, for example, the relationship between fire and burning, fire and the effect it brings about by burning, which is a burn thing, those two are objectively distinct. A fire can be a fire without burning. They are completely separable. If the burn thing gets unburned, the fire doesn't unfire, I guess you could say. The 2 things are really distinct. You have to discover a new object in order to go from, okay, this is fire, to this fire has or is burning something. And we can think of it the same as the relationship between a man and his child. A man and his child are really distinct. They don't imply each other. A man could die, for example, and his child be without the actual existence, at least actual existence in the terms of bodily existence, of his father. And then a father could, unfortunately, outlive his son, and his son die before him. And then the father would exist without the actual, that is, bodily existence of his son. They are really distinct. They are really separable. They do not imply the real existence of each other. Or actually, no, I won't even get into that. That's a bit complicated. So, second, we can have a cause and effect that are not objectively distinct, but they're subjectively distinct. They're distinct in concept, but they are identical in object. So we are kind of drawing forth a logical basis for the existence of the effect. The logical basis for the differing concepts within a single object, where we can order them. So the traditional example is going to be that eternity, we may speak of it as eternity in the soul, or eternity in angels, or eternity in God, but eternity is caused by immutability. That actually works kind of well, because the differing degrees of immutability which are present in the human soul, in the angelic intelligence, and then also in God, these differing degrees of immutability result in differing degrees of eternity. So when it comes to God, he is absolutely and in all ways immutable. Therefore, he is absolutely and in all ways eternal. He is not under the effects of the movement or causality of time. So we may describe this actually with a different term, which is it is the mere raison d'etre. And yes, I know that's not how the French pronounce it, but it's become basically an English word. So you guys can cry if you want to cry about my pronunciation skills, but it's merely the raison d'etre of the effect. It merely explains the existence of the effect without, it explains the concept of the effect, put it like that. But it doesn't explain the object of the effect, to put it like that. So it explains sort of that a concept within an object is, but it doesn't explain the object itself. So the another term that are used between these first and second are going to be the difference between a cause that is physical, which is going to be the first one, and a cause that is metaphysical. But really, I think the terms the cause in intellect or in consideration or in thinking versus a cause in being or in existence or in essence are going to be more helpful. Because really the relationships, again, while they have a foundation of the thing, are going to be cause for our intellect, for the consideration in which we go through, because we are not we are not simple intellects like the angels or God. We have to go through a process of what's called discursive reasoning. We know things bit by bit. So in relation to the scale, the first kind, the cause in being, in existence, that's going to be one that is objectively distinct, as we already said. So it's going to be a third degree of reasoning. And then the second kind, the cause in thinking, in intellect, in cognition, however you want to put it, where the cause and the effect are objectively identical, but they're subjectively distinct by their concepts. That's going to be second degree of reasoning. So in the evolution of dogma, the modernists who are going to engage in the sort of transformistic thinking are going to say that dogmas can arise from the first degree of distinction, the first type of cause, that is, which is the third degree of distinction, where those who are Orthodox Catholics are going to say that it could arise a new dogma, quote, new dogma, which is objectively distinct with an old dogma, yet conceptually distinct, objectively identical, yet conceptually distinct. That can only arise from a reasoning that involves the second type of cause, the cause which is cognition, or between concepts, or however you want to put it, because that is a second degree of reasoning, and the principle and the effect are going to be objectively identical. So this seems a bit, up to this point, a bit abstract, and it is a bit abstract. But in order to, you guys are above the age of reason, I'm assuming, so you guys can engage in abstract thinking. So, and if you can't engage in abstract thinking, you're below the age of reasoning. Do something better with your time. So when it comes to actual doctrinal application of this principle, the most obvious way is actually going to be in the Tractate Uno, so the tract on the unity of God, or some talk about it on the existence, essence, and attributes of God, or however you want to put it. So in De Deo Uno, we actually do have these relationships between the second type of cause and effect. So it's going to be first between what's called the metaphysical essence of God and the primary entitative attributes. So the relationship between God as actus purus, so God is pure act, and then also God as immutable. That's the relationship between the metaphysical essence and then an entitative attribute. So this type of reasoning is occurring here. And then in another place, we can also think of it between what's called the primary entitative attributes and the secondary entitative attributes. So something like the relationship between God's absolute immutability and God's eternity. God's eternity follows as a logical effect of his absolute immutability, because really eternity is absolute immutability in relation to time. So in theology, we actually do engage in this type of cause and effect reasoning. And it actually is going to occur a lot more places than you think if you just pay attention to the sort of argumentation that is going to occur throughout reading, for example, the Summa. St. Thomas does this a lot more than you think. And once you start looking for the difference between something which is, on the one hand, notional, on the other hand, might be a distinction between the essence and properties, and another between the cause and effect. You're going to start picking up on these things throughout the way in which scholastic theologians are going to argue for certain propositions of theology or articles of faith. So, lastly, I have this fun quote from Cardinal Cajetan, just to confirm that this distinction is something which is common. He says, hence, speaking formally, not uncommonly, is immutability said to be the cause of eternity, and immateriality the cause of immortality, and so on in other cases. So this is something that the Thomists have always recognized, and this is something that John of St. Thomas also speaks about in his cursus, specifically talking about logic. And then Sylvester Ferreira also talks about this in his commentary on the Summa Contra Gentiles. So this is something which is thoroughly Thomistic. This isn't something which is a sort of made up thing in the 20th century to try to capitulate away from the traditional Thomistic position, which some are going to say. So I didn't know. I was about to finish, but I need to get on my what is it called when you sort of start complaining about something, and it's something you complain about often. What is it? I can't remember. But yeah, there are. I can't find my thread on it, but if you look, you'll eventually find a Twitter thread where I did on this. But yeah, Newman, if you read his On the Evolution of Catholic Dogma, also known as the Newman Perron papers, where he writes Cardinal Perron after his conversion, it's very clear that Newman is principally taking his view on doctrinal development from Suarez. And in Suarez, he had a weird view on the way in which conclusions were virtually contained in their principles. So he couldn't figure out how the principle and the conclusion could be the same object and therefore both be of faith. So, in order to explain it, he had some type of continual revelation of the church, improperly speaking. So he had a weird continuing revelation view, and then Molina and later Thomists too fell into this error, where they overreacted against Suarez and started denying that theological conclusions could be defined of as faith. And then the Scotus and the Nominalists were on the other side, saying, well, actually, the habit of faith and the habit of theology were never distinct habits, and therefore, in itself, everything that has been a theological conclusion was always of faith for those who were able to discover that it is. So you kind of actually have multiple different schools of development of doctrine which arise by the time of Newman, and Newman actually takes one strand of it, which is coming from Suarez, and then adds in a bit of his own things, which come from his Englishness, I guess, is the best way of putting it, which is going to be a development which is based more upon the practical intellect than the speculative intellect, and it's going to be something which is driven more by emotion than elation. So Newman does have some particular errors theoretically, although in the whole, his work is within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. Nothing is in itself erroneous. It's just not ideal, if you want to put it like that. And actually, if you do look through the history of Newman's writings, and this is something we're going to be getting into a bit later in this series, if you look into the history of what Newman writes, reflecting back on his own thesis of doctrinal development, he's actually going to clarify and correct a lot of his errors. And later Catholic theology does the same thing with Newman. You see this was something common written about in late 19th century and throughout the 20th century of of especially Roman dogmatics is they do correct some of Newman's errors on doctrinal development. So this isn't something which was secret or anything, and Newman wasn't a trailblazer by any means when it comes to doctrinal development. He didn't even write the essay on the development of doctrine while he was Catholic. He was still Anglican when he wrote it. So if you take into consideration a lot of his later reflection, a lot of things begin to make a lot more sense, especially when you look at the sources in which he was using, which clearly were Suarez. You see this throughout a lot of his post-Catholic writings. Is Newman was a Suarez fan for sure, which wasn't too unusual during that time before the Leonine revival, even until the 1930s and 40s. I read an account of Father Austin Woodbury say that there was not one Thomist Jesuit left in Rome, that they were all Suarezians. I think Newman was actually trained in Gregorian University, which would have been the Jesuit university. So things will make a lot more sense when you start looking at the personal history of Newman, some of the theological background of him, and then also the other schools of development of doctrine. It's perfectly licit to hold to the majority position, which wasn't Suarez, wasn't Newman's views, and most of later Catholic theology corrected some aspects of Newman, and Newman even corrected himself. So, comment on the dispute between Garrigou-Lagrange and Marine Sola, please. I guess I'll be covering it a lot later. But my thoughts on the dispute between Garrigou-Lagrange and Marine Sola, basically Sola, and if you didn't notice, my profile picture right here is actually Marine Sola, so you can tell who I agree on this with. So when it comes to the dispute, I think Garrigou actually, and through I think he pronounced his last name Schultz, Father Schultz. If I'm horribly I actually have the book right here. A friend sent it to me so I can scan it. So let's see how you pronounce. He sent me it in his introduction. Yes, it's Father Schultz, Father Reginald Murray Schultz. Introduction in the history of dogma. Oh, thank you, computer, for telling me it's 11 o'clock. So Father Schultz was one of those responding to Marine Sola's essays. And Father Schultz was really the source for a lot of Garrigou's own thought on this matter. So I think when it comes to Garrigou and Schultz, and apologies if I'm just butchering that last name, but I think that Garrigou and Schultz have a very compelling philosophical case, because the whole question is surrounding whether the habit of faith could be specified by the same object, but a different formal consideration of that same object. So considering second degree of conclusion. Second degree development. Sorry, I don't know why I think of it as second degree of conclusion. So Father Schultz and Garrigou are going to say, well, when it comes to first degree, that's completely fine because you're just clarifying notions. When it comes to second degree, you have a different notion, even while it's objectively identical. Where, on the other hand, Marine Sola is going to respond, well, actually, you can. If it's the same revealed object, the church sort of supplies that move within that single object between different formal notions. So the church sort of nudges us along and helps us out in moving from one to another formal aspect of the same revealed object. So I think, at least to myself, the reasoning of Garrigou and Schultz is a lot easier to swallow. It is a lot easier on the philosophical level. But what makes me agree with Sola has to do with the history of the development of doctrine within the church. I think it's undeniable from a historian's perspective, we're going to be getting into this later, looking at the different examples of this, but it is undeniable that theological conclusions have been defined as of faith by the church. It's just impossible, I think, to disagree with that. So that mixed along with the fact that I think it's absolutely clear that before Molina uh, and Suarez's spat in the late 16th century, before that, looking back to generations of scholastics, going all the way back to uh, really the Golden Age, Bonaventure and St. Thomas write about this, that going back to the Golden Age of scholasticism, that there was these two schools. On the one hand, you had the Thomists and some of the Franciscans, and on the other hand, you had the Nominalists and some of the other Franciscans. And the dispute wasn't over whether theological conclusions could be of faith. The dispute was whether theological conclusions were of faith before or after the declaration of the church. It never entered the mind of theologians to dispute whether theological conclusions could be of faith. Never. Before the dispute between Suarez and Molina, it never entered the mind into the mind of theologians. So from the historical positions of theologians and from the historical instances of the definition of theological conclusions, I think while it may be philosophically more compelling to hold the Garrigou-Schultz view, absolutely it is absolutely more compelling on a sort of concrete lived experience of the church way to hold to the traditional Thomist position. I do think the nominalist / Scotist position, what eventually became the Scotist position, although I'm not convinced that Scotus himself held to it, what eventually became the Scotist / nominalist position, I think it's crazy to say that theological conclusions are of faith before the definition of the church. I think it's absolutely nuts. But that is the other position. The third and the fourth position just don't exist until the late 16th, early 17th century. So that is my ranting and raving about the Garrigou-Lagrange Marine Sola battle. I'm entirely open though to having my mind changed, and definitely this is just as much as an opportunity to teach as it is an opportunity to reflect on my own principles, for sure. And I think actually that Schultz is being translated right now by Dr. Minard, if I remember correctly. So maybe when Schultz comes out and I'm able to read it, I'm going to be reading it soon in Latin, which doesn't exactly provide the most precision for me. Reading in English is definitely a heck of a lot easier for me. But maybe, who knows? Maybe eventually I'll be doing a series on the Garrigou-Schultz view and how they would respond to some of the points which were made by Sola. And then you guys could basically make up your minds for yourself. But I think, again, as philosophically compelling as it may be, it just loses historically by a long shot in multiple different ways. Okay, that's all I have. Remember, if you do appreciate this sort of content, because again, this is unique content. Most other people are just doing stuff on current events or on whatever new controversy has arisen or just general sort of apologetics. But if you do appreciate scholastic theology for the people, for normal people, then definitely consider subscribing, becoming a patron, and sharing with your friends. So that's all I have, and God bless.